We now turn our attention away from the idea of management onto the idea of leadership. Now, they're not the same thing. If you imagine a manager is a position. So I can make you a manager, I can promote you to manager, I can change your job title to manager, and there you go, you are a manager. Whereas leadership, on the other hand, isn't a position, it's a perception. So you are only a leader if other people perceive you to be a leader. So not the same thing. When we're looking at leadership, some of the early theories talked about the idea of traits, and this is a psychological set of theories where around about the sort of 1950s time, it was felt that if you wanted to identify a good leader, what you needed to do was question a whole host of good leaders and then understand what characteristics or traits they then held. Now, it's not an exact science and there were a number of problems with it. So if you look at the sample of traits, they're very broad expressions, aren't they? Drive, energy, cooperation. The other problem with trait theory is the fact that actually different trait studies identified different traits. So there is a danger that we just end up with a massive, great big long list of characteristics. And maybe there's more to it than that. But that's what trait theories are all about, the understanding that you could look at a series of leaders, give them a questionnaire, and then try and understand the characteristics and the skills that they possessed. A little bit later on, we then move on to the idea of John Adair, which is action-centered leadership. Now, Adair is what we call a contingency theorist, and contingency theorists always mean the same. It means there is no one best way to be a leader. And Adair's argument was that, and what is a good leader depends on many, many different factors. So he said a good leader is one who knows when to focus on the job in hand, when to focus on the group, and remember back to the Hawthorne studies by Elton Mayo, groups are important here, and when to focus on the needs of the individual. So if you picture the scene, if you're thinking about a football manager knows when to focus on winning games. So at 2:30 on a Saturday afternoon in the dressing room, now is not the time for a little chat with the individual in the corner. Now's the time to focus on the task in hand. Absolutely getting out there, winning those 3 points. However, a good manager also knows when to focus on the group of players. So maybe we finish teams early one day and we go and spend some time together, okay, because that's about groups and team spirit. A good football manager also knows when to leave their office door open so that players who've got problems can come along and have a chat. So Adair's argument in an organisational context is that that's actually what a leader does. Knows when to focus on the job, knows when to focus on the individuals, and knows when to focus on pulling us together as a group. The time to do that will depend, remember contingency theory, on what's happening. Similar idea is that of Fiedler, so similar in that it is another contingency model, no one best way. And Fiedler actually started off as a psychological experiment. And the idea was to try and understand what kind of leaders there are. What he did was actually a very clever experiment. He took a group of leaders and then asked them to each think about their least preferred co-worker. So the person that they've enjoyed working with least over their working life. Now, if I asked you to imagine that individual, Fiedler's argument was that he assumed that we would all rank our least preferred co-worker as fairly rubbish across a series of scales. So we would perceive them to be unfriendly, uncooperative, hostile and guarded, and a long way away from the top end of the scales of friendly, cooperative, supportive and open. But that's not what he found. What he found was that by asking leaders to complete this, there was a statistical significant difference between two groups of scores. One group of leaders ranked their least preferred co-worker statistically more highly than the second group. And Fiedler said, look, those who ranked their least preferred co-workers statistically more highly were what he called human relations oriented leaders. You and I would see them as people managers. Those who ranked their least preferred co-workers statistically more lowly were task-oriented leaders, so people concerned with getting the job done and not concerned with human relations. Now, given that this is a contingency theory, Fiedler then said, there is a time and a place for both types of leadership. So if you're focusing on a crisis, if you have an organisation where things are going horribly, horribly wrong, then you want those task leaders. You want people who aren't going to worry about the people, who are going to focus on turning the organisation around. If, however, you've got a group of people who are professionals or talent and you're trying to protect the talent, then you need that considerate style of leadership. So a time and a place for both. That therefore means that for an organisation, if you are looking at recruiting people at senior levels, you're going to need a mix, because too many task-oriented leaders is going to cause you problems, and too many considerate HR type leaders is going to mean that sometimes you need somebody to play the bad cop. So a mix is a good skill. That's what organisations should be looking at. The next theorist is Warren Bennis, who talked about the idea of knowledge workers. Remember earlier in the notes we talked about the idea of the learning organisation. Okay, well, this is part and parcel of that theory. So when you're thinking about knowledge workers, recognise that for most organisations, the resource that's untapped is the people in your organisation. Organisations very rarely get the best out of their staff. And the theorist talked about the idea that most people in the workplace are only utilising 5 to 10% of their abilities and skills, saving the rest until the world outside work. So massive, massive untapped resource that organisations, if they make a change, can try and tap into. Interesting study linked into this, that if you increase your spending on training and development by 10%, then productivity rises by 8.5. If you increase your capex by 10%, your productivity only rises by 3.8. Moral of the story then, according to Warren, is invest in people, not machines. It's all about the skills of the workers. And he then comes to give a quote by Jack Welch, Chief Exec of General Electric, so a massive organisation, who said, what's it all about being Chief Exec? People, capital resources and ideas. But notice which one was first, the right people. Get the people right and you cannot fail. So Bennis then said, right, okay, so what is a good leader? And identified 7 qualities. Don't think of them as 7, think of them as 3 and 4, because the first 3 are a given. Any leader should be able to demonstrate these. So any leader should be technically competent, should know what they're doing. They should also have conceptual skill, which is like an innate level of intelligence, the ability to think. You don't get very many not very clever leaders, so the innate intelligence is going to be important. But also with a track record, so the fact you can demonstrate you've done it before. So if that doesn't differentiate, what does are the next 4 down. So this is what differentiates a good leader to an excellent leader. And the first one is people skills, the ability to communicate. If you think about the best manager you've ever worked for, I'm willing to bet that they are also one of the best communicators you've ever worked with. So that ability to share, to inspire, is all about communication. Bennis also talked about the idea of taste, spotting talent, identifying the diamond in the rough, and being able to make good decisions without good data. And finally, character. charisma, we talked about when we looked at referent power. We looked at charismatic authority. So that's a vein that's kind of running all the way through the chapter. So good leaders have good characteristics, the qualities that make the leader. So it's all actually about you. It's not about skill. It's about the kind of person that you are. So if that's about the leader, what about the follower? What is it that followers are looking for in character, given we've just said how important character is? You're looking for passion in your leader. You're looking for your leader to absolutely know exactly what's going on and to be almost devoted to it. The individual having a strong perspective. You're also looking for two-way trust. You trust them, but more importantly, they trust you. So as part of the character, if you have a leader who doesn't trust you, then it's highly unlikely you're going to trust them in return. You also want hope and optimism. We've talked a lot about football, but can you imagine that you're sitting down as a footballer and you're about to step onto the Wembley turf to play the FA Cup final, and in walks your manager, shuffling with their feet, looking down at the floor, saying, "We've got no chance." Well, that's not going to inspire you. That's not going to drive you. You want your manager to come striding into the dressing room and say, "We can win. We can do this." And again, that's what Bennis is talking about, this idea of inspiring and drive and hope. And you're looking for results in your leader, but you're also looking for recognition that we don't always win. So recognizing that if we tried it and it didn't work, what did we learn from it? Gretzky's quote there, who's an ice hockey player, "You miss all of the shots you don't take, so take the shots. Have a go." And by having a go, that's what makes you the good leader. Heifetz then talks about understanding what is meant by leadership and recognizing that it's very hard to define leadership because leadership is actually what leaders do. So the definition comes from the task. The task of leading is what leadership is. Blake and Mouton carried this idea and talked about the concept of a managerial grid. It links back to Fiedler with the contingency model, talking about concern for tasks and people. Remember those task leaders and the people leaders. What Blake and Mouton did was ask people to rank their manager and rank their manager on a grid against two dimensions: concern for task, concern for people, again, like Fiedler. And what they found was that we've got a series of positions across that grid, the managerial grid. At the bottom, we've got 1-1 managers. Low concern for task, low concern for people. And pretty much this is the world's worst manager because nothing's getting done and all your staff are completely fed up. In which case that person really shouldn't be a manager. As opposed to your 1-9 managers, which is your country club approach to management. Everyone's having a fab time, we're having a nice time, everybody loves the manager, but absolutely nothing's getting finished or done. Those of you who like your television programmes, it's pretty much the David Brent, The Office style of management. Blake and Mouton said most managers would be round about 5-5, middle of the road managers. Or as they referred to it, also dampened pendulum. Now a dampened pendulum, if you imagine when it swings, doesn't swing to the fullest extent. It kind of swings around the middle. So their argument was that there's scope to improve. We can improve across the concern for task and we can improve across the concern for people. So actually what they want to try and do is encourage managers to move across that diagonal. Notice your 9-1 managers, so no concern at all for individuals, but massively high concern for the task. So everything's being done, everything is driven around the job, but people are leaving and people are miserable and unhappy. But remember when we looked at Fiedler, there is a time for that. If you have a crisis, then that's what you want. And then finally at the top, you've got your 9-9, which is where Blake and Mouton argued we should be trying to move towards. Now, it's not a perfect model, and the reasons for that are as follows. Who's to say that 9-9 is right? Because we've seen all the way through that the right manager, the right leader, depends on a number of different factors. Remember too that where you're placed on the grid is the perception that other people have of you. Okay, well, that may be flawed. The best manager will vary depending on the organisation. So if you are managing a group of people in one industry, then what will work will be very different to managing that same a different group of people in a different industry. And remember also, what you're talking about really is innate preference. You're talking about personality. So some managers are good with people. Other managers are less good with people, but very good with tasks. So by saying I want you to be a 9-9 manager is actually making you be something that you're not, which is stressful and difficult and sometimes not useful or helpful. So what might be better, as we saw before, is to bring in different managers at different times. So when you're recruiting managers, to recruit across a variety of strengths and skills. We've then got a couple of smaller theories. We've got transactional leaders. And Burns argued that a transactional leader views very much the approach between manager and subordinate as any other transaction. So with transactional analysis, transactional leaders are effectively saying, I give you stuff, you give me stuff. As long as we're both recognising that fact, that's all there is to it. It's a simple transaction. So at lunchtime, if you went and bought a sandwich, then that was a transaction. You gave them the sandwich, you gave them money, they gave you a sandwich. Transactional leaders, your manager gives you the money, you give them the service and compliance, two things. Now that's okay, but sometimes we want more than just money for service. Sometimes what we need is a transformational leader who can inspire, not just give me the salary in exchange for the basics. So transformational leaders recognise that inspiration and motivation is crucial. If you want to get the best out of your staff, then inspire them to be the best that they can be. Boyd is the theorist here, saying, look, if you've got a massive change to undertake in your business, then you don't just want transactions, you want transformations. You want a leader who will inspire, who can then change culture. So what is this all about? It's about being a visionary leader, having empathy with the staff, empathy being the idea of understanding, and empowerment again. There's that expression we've seen a number of times now. And finally, we've got the distributed idea of leadership. So with distributed leadership, recognising that actually it's not about top-down leadership. It's not about the board of directors making all the decisions, because actually what you want is every level in the organisation demonstrating leadership. What's it all about? It's all about interactions, how we interact across the business. It's a little bit like the ideas of empowerment. So, what means or why do we assume that only good leaders are found on boards of directors? You could have good leaders anywhere in your organisation. And actually, it's useful to have them in different places, because if you are making decisions as a manager, then make the decisions when you know what the role entails. So distributed leadership makes a lot of sense. So actually leadership is about collaboration. It's not about giving out jobs. Leaders understand how to work with other leaders.